people who were most willing to come on board were new college graduate, or that was at least what we were trained to look for, was new college grads.
Yeah.
And especially people who are new college grads in like October have been looking for a job right out of college for several months now and are so desperate to find anything. They will do whatever you tell them.
I'm open and honest. I was one of the guys that wrote some of the fake reviews, right? Many people have talked about how ex-employees have written, and I was one of the guys to be like, heck yeah, I'll write your review. I'll put a 5-star. I'll say this, I'll say that. And at the time, it wasn't because I was like, well, we got to lie, we got to cheat. I was thinking like, well, I want to, this one person had a bad experience. I don't want that to ruin the whole business for everyone else. So I'll do my part in that kind of stuff. But again, that's not normal behavior. And if you're at Target and somebody tells you like, hey, you need to write a positive review for Target, that's not good.
All right, Mitch, you were in Cydcor for quite a while, 3 years, according to your message. And you have, like you've told me already, a unique take on this, because in this series, we tend to hear just about all the negatives, all the cult-like aspects, all the ways that these companies prey on people. But it's not to say, and we haven't heard this in a while, but it's not to say you can't effectively get some positive things out of this. And I want to quote directly from your message when you contacted us. You said that you believe your experience was as positive as it could have been, even though you saw plenty of shady things. The client that we had, what we actually sold, the people I worked with on the better side of the business. However, and this is a big however, I believe this goes to show that the system at its core is corrupt, and the way the business is structured, you have to be an outlier to not break ethics. And you've seen some good people turn bad because of the nature of the business. So I'm sure we'll get into kind of your whole story here in this interview. But looking back on it, since you've been out a couple years now, how do you balance the positives and the negatives in your memory of being with Cydcor?
Yeah, so I guess that's a good question. So to give brief background on me so I can explain kind of what I mean by positives is I was a little different entering the business, is that I was not your typical interview. I didn't come straight out of college and go into this business. I was one of those very few people that actually knew what they wanted to do in college. And I was an elementary education school teacher. That's what I did all 4 years of college. That was my major. I did it all 4 years. I was the only male that did it. I was pretty, not too bad to be on college and be the only male in your major. After that, I went straight out of college, got a job right away, and loved it. Did it for 4 years. Great job. Absolutely loved it. Loved teaching. Got some great memories from there. And in my opinion, I was pretty successful at it. I won some awards. I started running some kind of clubs around the school. But after 4 years, I kind of was sitting down and going, well, now what, right? Teaching is you do the same job for 30 years and then you retire, or you go and get like a master's degree and become like an administrator, which I absolutely did not want to do because it would take everything I love out of teaching and put it with all the hate. So after 4 years, my wife and I made the difficult decision of like, let's find something else. So I had a 4 years of career experience. I was married at the time. I was pretty well settled. But I had no skills. The only thing I had ever known was teaching, right? So when I started applying for jobs, I didn't know what I was looking for. There was no specific path. I was applying for like administrative assistant jobs and just like any sort of like office culture thing I could think of. Never done sales in my entire life. Never, ever had I ever done a sales kind of gig at all. So I one day sitting in front of the computer, sending 100 resumes a day, I typed in sales and just kind of saw kind of what popped up, and I started applying to places. And that's when I started getting responses. I hadn't really gotten any response before that. And then all of a sudden, within like 2 weeks, I was getting responses. I basically got, three job offers I got. So first job offer I went to and rode all the way up to the top of skyscraper, got a nice view of the city, ended up sitting down with maybe like a manager or something like that, but didn't get past the interview. Come to find out that actually was an ICL itself. Several years later, and I never made it past the first round interview, which I thought was quite hilarious, given where my career ended up going. And then so basically came down with two companies, and both companies pretty much were the exact same. And literally the reason why I chose one company over the other is just because the office looked nicer. And my interview went pretty well, but come to find out the other company that was an ICL as well. That was for an AT&T retail campaign. And this one was this was office supplies business to business. So that's kind of how I found out the business. So I do want to make the point that these are very prevalent businesses. I know a lot of times, especially if you're in it, you feel like, well, we're unique. There's no one else like us. We're doing something totally different. Literally, I interviewed and met with 3 of the exact same modeled businesses before I even got to my first company that I worked for, which I thought was pretty interesting. I would later then see like those managers at like the conferences and that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, and that's when the jigsaw pieces connected. And I was like, oh, that's what that was. Got it. So I started this place. It was called Raleigh Marketing Consultants. It was in Raleigh, North Carolina. And the reason why I said I probably had the most positive experience is because I feel like ethically, morally, what we did was as right as it possibly could be. I've seen a lot of your videos, heard a lot of the people talk, and they've definitely experienced, I think, some very shady stuff, right? Whatever type of business you work on, if you've got people lying to you, if you've got people telling you it's one thing and it's something completely different, then you should leave that, whatever it is. Doesn't matter if it's working at a law office or a doctor's office or anything like that. Why I say positive is so the client that I worked with was business to business. And for those who are in the business, they know there's 3 main types of campaigns. You've got retail, which is working at like a Sam's Club and a Walmart. You've got residential, which is going door to door, and you've got business to business. And Alex, if you had to choose one of those 3 that you had to do, I think 90% of people would say like, well, I'll go to businesses. Because I sat down, I worked with like doctors and lawyers and people who owned businesses and that kind of stuff. And I wasn't sitting down at a Sam's Club with people walking back and forth trying to buy groceries, trying to convince them to, hey, come on over to me, or going to someone's house when they weren't expecting me and trying to do that kind of stuff. On top of it being a business to business campaign, it also was office supplies, which compared to a lot of the other campaigns is an actual physical product. It's not an abstract idea like energy or insurance or something like that. It's a tangible thing that I could see in the office. I could see it being delivered. I could see it making an impact. I've obviously used office supplies myself in the past, so I know how it works. I know it's a real thing, and I know I can walk into Staples and see like, this is a real thing. This is the price. And obviously businesses use it. Doesn't really matter what type of business you are, you can use this product. So I genuinely felt like I'm actually doing something that is actually helping people. I'm not actually just doing this, management training program to make myself better, but I'm actually genuinely helping businesses as well. As far as the office goes, the guy who interviewed me ended up becoming the manager of the second company that I worked for, was possibly the best guy that could possibly be interviewed. Very sharp, very well put together, very goal driven, very honest, very ethical. From the very first interview, I knew this was a sales job. I was going to be going to businesses, and it was going to be commission only. 100%. That was out there right away. In fact, when I left the interview, that's what me and my wife talked about on the phone. Is like, hey, so this is a commission only job. Obviously, never done anything like that before. What do we think? And she basically said, bless her heart, it's up to you. You make the decision. So we decided to kind of go with it. But so right from the beginning, it was as clear as it could be. And the first day, I knew when I walked in, I was going to go out. I was going to go selling. Obviously, I didn't know exactly what it was going to look like. I didn't know like the numbers and what we were going to say or any of that kind of stuff. But I had as clear a picture as I could. Our office, the way our office was structured, it was very, I feel like, on the up and up. I'm sure there were some behind the scenes things that were going on. And of course, there's drama and politics, just like kind of any company kind of has. But as far as like trying to manipulate people and that kind of stuff, we weren't really about that. There was no trying to get somebody promoted as quick as possible or forcing these people on team. You had to earn your spot. If you wanted an interview, you had to earn it. If you wanted to build a team, you had to build that team. And if you had 9 people and you almost hit the marks, doesn't matter. You had to have the full 10 for it to happen. We would give out assignments where I would see the numbers for the day. I would write out the spreadsheet and write out the numbers and see that kind of stuff. I would see all the thing, we talk, we'd be very open and we talk. We had like worksheets that we used to keep track of like, how's this person doing? What do we need to talk about? How do we need to help this person out and that kind of stuff. And again, genuinely felt like I was really helping out and being a part of something and that kind of thing. The office when I came in was already like a top 10 office. So it already had a good amount of people. It already was doing pretty well. And once I entered the office, we started to really grow and we ended up actually expanding out. And I was part of that expansion team. So I only really ever saw like the best side of the business that I can. Now I say all that to preface the fact that despite of all that, I still 100% failed. Like there's no possible way I could say like, I was super successful at this. I definitely failed. In terms of numbers and metrics, I never ever hit halfway to assistant management, building my team and that kind of stuff. But the reason I wanted to come on here is not so much to say like, well, I failed, therefore you can't do it, but to really look at like, why did I fail? Because if I look at my story and I look at all the things that I've experienced throughout it, I think it would be pretty hard for you to come up with a reason as to like, well, this guy just wasn't working hard enough, or this guy didn't understand the business, or this guy didn't kind of do any of that kind of stuff.
Sure.
And so that's what I mean when I kind of say it was a positive experience. I'm not walking away from the business saying like, F these guys, they really screwed me.
Yeah.
Oh, they stole money from my account. I don't think any of that kind of stuff happened. I know it has for sure to other people, but that wasn't my experience. But I would still say you got to be really careful about what you're walking into here.
It's hard to argue with you that you were not that you're not just this bitter failure, because going by what you told us, you won Leader of the Year multiple times. You went to Cydcor headquarters. You, like you mentioned already, you helped expand out and open a new office, ran dozens of road trips, trained and interviewed about 100 people, and were even sent to offices to help train others. A failure who's not good at this business doesn't do those types of things. They are the ones that need to get trained. They are the ones that need help. They're not the ones that get sent on all these opportunities. And you mentioned early that when you started with Raleigh Marketing Consultants, you knew exactly that it was a commission-only gig. Yet, when I go to Glassdoor and I look at the reviews for Raleigh Marketing Consultants, I see multiple people who in their reviews say this, yet that is rebutted by the owner's response that it is not a commission-only job, that they are not a door-to-door sales job. So, I'm really curious as to why you, someone on the inside, is able to see that, yet someone who's responding to someone who's criticizing this company for those very reasons is going to go against that and say, no, you're wrong. That's actually a lie.
I have not seen some of those reviews in a very long time, so it's interesting that you bring that up. Yeah, it's a good question. So it's interesting. I've mentioned before that 99% of the people that I've worked with have been really positive. The 1% is part of the guy that you're talking about is one of those 1%ers that was not part of those. But it's interesting being the perspective on the inside, right? If you've been in the business and if you're watching this, you've been in the business, then you kind of know how it feels. It's not like you're not aware of all the stuff that's happening, right? It's not like I was sitting there going like, man, I work totally normal office hours and I'm not overworked at all. I knew that I was getting overworked, but it was also a point of pride, right? It was also like I'm doing something that no one else will be willing to do, right? I knew that I was not making as much money as I possibly could, right? But that again was a point of pride. It's like I'm sacrificing now so I can pay later, right? Pay it now, pay later. That's a phrase that they use quite a lot.
Yep.
We knew there's a high turnover rate in the office. Even with our positive office that I believe we had, there was still a high turnover. You're losing people every single week. People are coming in and out. And that's difficult to imagine if you've never been in the business because you're used to people come in for 6 months and then they leave. But this business more than any other is a week-to-week business. This business survives week by week. You could have the best week in the world and be the #1 office in the nation, which the office I was a part of, we were that. And that's awesome. That's great. But if you have one bad week and a bunch of people quit, or you don't get a lot of interviews or something like that, that can effectively kill your entire business. So, we're aware of the high turnover rate. We're aware of people quit all the time. But again, that's just a thing that we would reinforce for ourselves is, well, they must be quitters. Look, they quit and I stayed on. I must have something special that they don't I must be doing something that they don't get. When in reality, of course, there's just so many variables that come into place, right? I mean, I literally over the course of my career, I probably interviewed, trained hundreds of people, so many people, I physically cannot retain names and faces. There are a few that stick out, but there's people who have quit for the job wasn't for them. They needed the money. Their family member died. Their car died. Like, there's so many reasons why somebody would just leave. It's pretty unfair of us to just blanket as, well, they don't have what it takes. They're not as committed as me. But unfortunately, that's kind of part of the system. One of the reasons I say the system is corrupt is because they need you to believe that you're something special. When the numbers don't lie, you're not going to be successful. It's just you're not going to become the owner. Or if you do become the owner, you're not going to become the owner that you think you're going to become, and that kind of stuff. And that's what I started kind of seeing and really learning towards the end of my career, which is why I ended up leaving, and that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, the reviews, I'm open and honest. I was one of the guys that wrote some of the fake reviews, right? Many people have talked about how ex-employees have written, and I was one of the guys to be like, heck yeah, I'll write your review. I'll put a 5-star. I'll say this, I'll say that. And at the time, it wasn't because I was like, well, we got to lie, we got to cheat. I was thinking like, well, this one person had a bad experience. I don't want that to ruin the whole business for everyone else. So I'll do my part in that kind of stuff. But again, that's not normal behavior. And if you're at Target and somebody tells you like, hey, you need to write a positive review for Target, that's not good. It's
interesting that you talk about, you had talked about the 99% versus the 1%. I feel like the 1% being the problem is a recurring theme, not just in here, but in our culture in general. And
yes, fair enough.
You said 99% were good people, but you had some scumbags, quote unquote. And I'm sure someone.
As you can probably imagine, it's usually the higher up people, right? Like the one manager that I have. As you mentioned before, so I've been to Cydcor headquarters. I have walked into the belly of the beast, as it were, and sat down and had one-on-ones with people like Gary Polson, Vera, Quinn, which if you're familiar with Cydcor, there's like as high level as you could probably get. Consultants like Rich Danella, Jim Rothman knew me by name, right? Would be very, oh, hey, Mitch, what's up? Shake my hand. I've had lunch and dinner with like Matt Osborne and like these kind of people. So I knew these people, recognizable to them. And, it's tough to look at them and say, well, they're just completely good people, right? They must have no idea of what's going on and that kind of stuff. When you look at the numbers and you think about like, well, how many times have they given the same speeches, had the same one-on-ones, met someone like me and had a conversation, and then that person quit the next year, and they keep going and they keep giving the same speeches and that kind of stuff. Eventually, you're just completely naive and you're totally innocent and you have no idea what's really going on, or you've got some more sinister notions.
And these people you mentioned, Gary Polson, Vera Quinn, all the big wigs in top of Cydcor, having met them, having spent so much time with them, and with some of them being on a first name basis, do you feel like some of them are in this for sinister reasons, or do you feel like they legitimately believe that they are helping people become entrepreneurs?
So I've been out of the business for about 2 years, obviously done a lot of reflection in those 2 years. And I don't think there's got to be a certain level that you get to where you have to make a choice. You either have to commit to this business and say, you know what, no matter what, I'm going to do this. And that means lying, manipulating, telling people what they want to hear, or you quit, which is why you see so many owners quit, right? Is because they get to that point and they go, you know what, I can't do this. It's not worth what I'm getting out of it. And that's why you see so many owners quit. So for people who have been in it for 20 years or top of the pyramid, as it were, I do have to say, either they're completely dumb and they have no idea how this business works, or they're being facetious. They're deliberately manipulating and that kind of stuff. Because I mean, I've got notebooks on notebooks of notebooks of the same notes, the same meetings over and over and over again, the same acronyms, the same words, told by the same people. I've been, and if they're having those conversations with me, they're having those conversations with other people. It comes to a point where you keep saying the same thing over and over again, and people keep quitting. It's like, well, what's happening here?
Sure. You had talked a little bit about how this picture that they sell you in Cydcor, this idea of becoming an owner, and even if you become an owner, you're not going to become the owner that they tell you you're going to become. And that's true for about 99% of people. Yet you still have these people like, like Vera Quinn and other people from past Cydcor interviews, people like Shaine Thurman, Ken Lear, Michael Sessions, people that are probably that 0.001% of people who have made it to the point where people view them as, that's where I want to be. And that shows me this is possible, which I guess technically it is. But then what makes people like that different from the 99.9% who don't make it? Is it just because they're tougher and they're better and the other 99% are failures, or is there something else based on what you know about them?
So I would say, forgot about Michael Sessions there. I listened to the whole Michael Sessions podcast at the once, and so thank you for that memory. I appreciate that. So obviously if you're in the business, I know it's very hard to kind of see, because I was in the exact same position. I would hear like naysayers and that kind of stuff and just kind of brush off. But that's only if you're coming from the point of view of everything that they're telling me is true and it's all 100% fact. Then yes, of course you're going to believe them and you're going to double down and stuff. But you got to come to the conclusion that if they're not outright lying to you, they're at least manipulating the stats a little bit. And I mean that about everything, right? If you have a manager and they're telling you about the field stories and what I went through in the field and all that kind of stuff, what is probably happening is they're taking someone else's field story and making it their own, or combining or leaving off some other facts. I built this company from nothing, borrowed $10,000 from the parents, kind of thing, right? Like, well, let's leave that fact. Let's just, because the story sounds better, and they have to create a story that you can buy into, that anyone can do this, that anyone can be successful, that you could literally have zero skills, which I had when I first started, zero net worth, which I had, and build yourself into anything. And then the higher up you get, the more you got to make that look, right? So if I look at Michael Sessions and I truly believe like that guy's worth millions of dollars and he could buy any house that he wants to get, then I would probably be like, okay. But if you come to the truth is that guy's probably worth like $100,000, which is a huge amount of money. I would love to have it, but that's probably the truth. Especially, with my second business that I was a part of that we can kind of talk about, I got to see more the management side of things, and it just doesn't line up, the money that they're making and that kind of stuff, right? The guy who interviewed me eventually became my manager. So I saw him build an entire team. In fact, it was him and me building his entire team. When I came on, he was like super close, but then that entire team left and it was literally just me and him. And we had there was a bar down the street that we went to. We had drinks, we sketched out a whole plan, and we built that team from nothing. But once we moved to Baltimore, all of a sudden that story started changing a little bit. It started becoming, well, I did all of this. This all happened because of this. And things I know had happened to other people. All of a sudden he was claiming, well, this is what I did. And I get it. I get he had to do that to make that stuff. But then I started to realize like, well, that's what they're all doing. They're all just stealing stories, making up stories, adding facts, leaving off facts to make the story sound as good as possible, because they've got to sell you on this dream. Because if they have one bad week in this business, it's over.
Yeah.
That's all it takes. One bad week or one person to quit, the right person quits, it's finished.
Yeah, I couldn't help but relate so strongly to some of the things you said, talking about picking and choosing facts, talking about creating a story that you can make someone buy into. And as you were talking about that, I remembered some of the things that I used to tell people on my team, people I were interviewing, is people in the office that started out as one story, but then you kind of manipulate some of the facts to fit this situation to make it apply. And then maybe next week you change a few more things to make it apply to something else. And the whole concept of getting people into this business only works if that narrative is believable. And you can use examples of these individuals and how they build themselves up into something. I feel like a common theme in a lot of the more recent interviews that I've done is these big names. So people like Michael Sessions, people like Vera Quinn, Shaine, Thurman, Gary Polson. within Cydcor, these are the Mount Rushmore. These are the gods upon gods upon gods. If you get to sit, if you meet one of these people at a conference, you sit down with them, you write notes, you soak in everything they say. Yet outside of this insulated universe, if you talk to people who know business, people that, maybe they write for the Wall Street Journal, or they write for Business Insider or Forbes magazine, or these credible business publications that know the ins and outs of the business world, you bring these names up to them, they'll be like, who are you talking about? I've never heard of these people.
Yep.
And you have to kind of create, I remember something that my owner always told me is that to inspire us is that every day you go into a store and you create something out of nothing. And that's what these people have done. They've created this false narrative of themselves. I mean, granted, Michael Sessions, despite the many, many lawsuits out against him, we have to always mention Michael Sessions' lawsuits in every interview we bring him up in. We're not doubting he's successful. We're not doubting that Vera, Quinn, or Gary Polson are successful and probably pretty wealthy. But outside of this created narrative of I'm a big shot, I'm self-made, I'm really good at business, you're a nobody. Nobody knows who you are.
Yep.
And I found that to be really interesting, that if you look at, and this is one reason why they tell you don't look at outside resources. Anybody who's not in this business just will not understand. Or if they were in this business and now they're out and they're writing negative things, they're just bitter failures, right? Which in reality means they're probably people with some morals and ethics that didn't want to screw over people for the rest of their lives. I just find that fascinating that they've created this false universe for themselves. And that's one of the reasons why you say, one bad week, the whole act starts to crumble, right? Because it doesn't take much. If you're living in a false reality, it doesn't take much for that false reality to start to crumble eventually.
I agree. Well, you make an interesting point, right? It is very much a bubble universe, right? If you're in it, you know the people and they're the gods, right? But if you did something like go on the Cydcor YouTube channel, they have like 10 subscribers, like 100 views a video, right? Which is like, oh, that's kind of weird, right? Or if you go on the Cydcor Glassdoor reviews, which I've done, you'll see like, oh, it's like negative stuff. It's like not good. Right. It is interesting. I mean, I can even give an example myself. I'm guilty of creating these stories, right? A story I have, or I used to tell people from when I was in the field, is one day I was out in the field in Baltimore, not the greatest of my area in Baltimore for sure, selling to a junkyard, and a junkyard dog bit me in the back of my leg and sunk its teeth into the back of my calf. And despite all of that, I still made that sale. And now that story is true. However, it is exaggerated. I exaggerated that story because yes, I was at a junkyard. Yes, a dog attacked me, but its teeth did not actually go into my leg, right? Its teeth grazed my leg, thank God, because it could have been a lot worse than it was, right? But that small tweak is happening over and over and over again. And if your person's been in it over longer, just years and years and years, the story is getting built on that kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. I told that story because it sounds a lot better. The dog actually bit me. It got a good chunk, and I still made the sale no matter what. Haven't maintained a positive attitude, right? That kind of thing. Then like, well, it was a near miss and the dog almost got me. It's also a bit of a red flag that I would have an experience like that and not think like, hey, I'm in a kind of a dangerous situation here, but rather it's a point of pride. I'm doing something that no one else would do. And that's something that I look back on and I'm like, you're such an idiot, dude. What were you thinking? I had no health insurance at the time. I had nothing to fall back on for sure. But that's an example of just one of the many stories that's like repeated and told, something that actually happened to me, but it's tweaked just a little bit to get the better narrative going.
Sure.
And that kind of stuff.
I was really hoping you were going to say, yes, I did get bit by a dog, but it was a Chihuahua. I was some ridiculous thing.
It was a real actual giant pit bull. And it was real, but it was a near miss. But the guy definitely was like, don't sue me, don't sue me, don't sue me. He bought like maybe like a $50 printer off of me or something like that.
Yeah.
If you're in the business, a sale's a sale, man. I'll take a sale anyway.
Sale's a sale. Yeah, if you buy from me, I'm not gonna sue you, bro. We're good.
That's one one of my fun field stories that I get to carry with me.
Yeah, and I think what you said after you said that story was a really good point, that should have been a red flag, because I don't think anybody would consider, oh, I'm going to go to a junkyard today and get bitten by a dog, and that's just part of the job. You know, stories that we've heard from other videos. I got arrested today. That's just part of the job.
Yep.
No, it's not part of the job. You're probably doing something illegal.
Well, I can tell you from a business to business, I don't have any retail experience or residential experience, but we would obviously hear about these offices and interact with them, and we would use their experiences to make our experience look better.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, we're not having the cops called on us, right? Do you want to go bother somebody on, on a Thursday night at their house, right? We didn't have to work weekends. We're businesses, so we deal with businesses during business hours, right? So we had the most normal schedule you could have.
Yeah.
Worked plenty of long days, but like you got the weekends off
Mhm.
and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it just the thing you got to watch out for is just how everything is kind of twisted into the positive, and that it's always better.
Yeah. You were there for a long time. And before we started this recording, you had talked a little bit about how you and your wife decided to up and move. You were looking for a different career path, and you kind of laid it all out. This is a commission only job and yada, yada, yada. So you were both in agreement about this.
Yep.
I'm really curious to know, though, how was the opportunity initially sold to you, and then how did that maybe change? Because you were there for 3 years and won Leader of the Year. Congratulations, by the way. 2 years. Where I'm
definitely put that on my resume for sure.
Absolutely. Leader of the Year. Yeah.
Sure.
And the reason I ask it is because this is almost always framed as a 1-year management training program. So after you were there for a couple of years, was it like, this is taking a lot longer than I thought, or were you just along for the ride, kind of waiting to see what was going to happen?
Good question, right? So I mentioned before kind of my interview process, right? And it was pretty straight laid out. Now, the other thing that was laid on me, and I'm sure this happened to you when you got interviewed, you got a sheet of paper that like outlined, well, this is the management training plan. This is what makes us special, makes it different. I got the same sheet of paper, and it broke down, okay, here's the, I think it was like a junior account management, corporate trainer, assistant manager, manager. And it would go through each steps. And again, they're very, sales, it's commission only, but it also had in parentheses next to each thing how long you should be in each role, right? And the first role was like a week, and then it was like 2 to 4 weeks, and then it was like 6 to 12 months, and then it was like, within a year you should be at management stage. And obviously, having no experience with this, I took that at face value. That's what I took away, and I thought, okay, well, I can do this now. So a year from now, I can have some experience I don't have at all, and I can start getting into more management stuff. Obviously, you don't really know what that looks like when you're in your first round interview. You don't know managing what. How are you managing people, right? How does that kind of work and that kind of thing? So I kind of stuck to those timelines. So I started day one, and I was like, okay, so my timeline is a week. I got to get out of this promotion because that's what the average person does to get into the next stage. And so I was like hyper day one. Got my notebook. I'm taking notes. I'm writing down everything. I'm asking questions. Oh, there's this thing called one-on-ones. I'm going to set some one-on-ones. I'm going to go out of my way and do this. I'm going to participate in office night. I'm going to do this because I knew if I can just do that, then I'm going to get promoted. And it worked, right? In a week, okay, got out of that position, started going solo, got my first territory. So had my training buddy, who's the guy who interviewed me. We went around, kind of showed me the territory. We made some sales, and then it comes time for Mitch's first day solo. And I go out there and I make 0 sales. And I was like, well, this sucks. And I walked back into that office today, fully prepared to quit. And I was like, I tried it. I went out solo. It just clearly isn't for me. And the manager at my time kind of word saladed me and just kind of talked, which is what he's known for. And it kind of eventually got me to stay. And so I came back the next day, went out solo again, and made 4 sales. And my mind was blown. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just walking into places, people are buying case paper for me and stuff like that. And so that probably is the thing that hooked me. If I have to say what got you hooked, that's probably what hooked me is those 4 sales. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess I can do this. So I went, I did my thing. I did the solo thing. And they said, I think it was 4 weeks it should take you to get promoted to the next stage. And I was on week 4 and I hadn't got promoted. And I was pretty much planning to stick to that timeline. If I'm not promoted by the end of this week, I'm moving on. I'm going on to the next thing. We ended up going to a road trip that week. That was my first road trip. And I was like, okay, well, I'll try it out. It's my last week. Let's see what happens. Walked into, you know, a shitty little Motel 6 or something like that. I can't really remember. And there were 6 guys and 2 beds. And I was like, I don't know how this situation's going to work out. And they were like, well, you're sleeping on that bed. And I was like, okay. So that was kind of a red flag there for me. But I ended up getting promoted that week. I got promoted by like a Thursday, like hit the numbers, got knocked out of the park. I felt really, and I was like, okay, this works. I mean, clearly it works because they told me it's going to fit this time frame. And I got it in this time frame and it works. And so from there I was sold. So obviously then I'm in the corporate trainer position. And I specifically remember being in that position, and you ask people, oh, how long have you been in the business? Oh, I've been in the business for a year, 9 months. I'm like, oh, I've been in it for like 4 weeks. I'm in the same meetings you're in. I'm doing the same stuff you're in. I'm learning to interview. But as you get older and as time goes on, you start becoming the person that's like, well, it's been a year and a half. It's been 2 years. It's been 3 years. I've got one friend of mine who's still in the business. It's been 8 years.
Oh,
and
God.
you start getting the weird looks of like, oh, okay, interesting. And then in your head, you're like, yeah, I don't know what else I could do. I've done everything. I hang out on the weekends. I do all this stuff. I know the material back and forth. I could sell you a case of paper. I can interview people. I can train people. So over time, it just became more and more apparent that it wasn't working. And eventually, especially towards the end, I was getting no new advice. There was no new lessons I was learning. And I'd go to my manager at the time, who's the guy who's been with me since day one. I'd be like, listen, man, my crew's not growing. I'm not doing anything. What do I need to do different? And his response was, well, you just got to have and maintain a positive attitude. I'm like, I know how to have and maintain a positive attitude. I've been here for 3 years. I know how to be on time. I know how to be prepared. I know how to say the pitch correctly. Like that can't possibly be what I'm missing, right? You know, it would be things like, well, you got to spend more time with your guys. So me and my wife, we would have a board game night every week where all the basically office would come down, cook a giant spaghetti meal, play some board games, have some fun. I'd go to every office night, go on the weekends, lunches, dinners, breakfasts. I mean, you name it. I did it all. And just, I hit a physical wall where there was no movement. And that is, I guess, is eventually what caused me to leave. You know, I mentioned before, I was originally in Raleigh marketing consultants. We built that office up, ended up getting promoted and moving to Baltimore. The guy who I'd been with since day one decided to move. And my wife and I decided to move with him. And that's really when the red flags started appearing, because I went from an office of like 15 to 20 people to now it's like an office 5. And obviously, so then you get more responsibility. You start seeing a lot more behind the scenes kind of stuff. I started to see a lot of stuff. First of all, just the moving process at all. Here was the guy that together, him and I had built the office. And never once did he come to me and say to my face, hey, Mitch, I want you to move with me to Baltimore. Mm-hmm. Never happened. I ended up getting a request from his boss. My manager at the time said, hey, it'd be a really good idea if you did this. And I was like, oh, okay. I hadn't even considered it because he hadn't come to me. He went to other people and he asked them. I just assumed that's what he wanted to do. The big person who was very reluctant to move was my wife, totally understandably, moving to a city we'd never been to before. You know, when you hear Baltimore, Maryland, certain images usually come to mind, not usually the most positive ones. If you've ever seen The Wire, congratulations. So she was a little hesitant for sure. So he sat down with her and had a meeting with her. And to her credit, she swears, he said, I promise you in 6 months, he will be promoted if he comes with me. Obviously, that did not happen. Even the fact that we were moving to Baltimore was a very weird phrase, because since day one, since I interviewed with him, there were 2 things I knew about this guy. One, he wanted to open up his office in Austin, Texas. And that is all he talked about, Austin. And he did research on Austin nightlife and did trips out there and loved Austin and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, well, he's going to Austin. That's what's going to happen. And literally like the day after he got promoted, all of a sudden it became Baltimore, Maryland. And I asked him, I said, like, well, Baltimore, what happened to Austin? And he got this very stoic look and he was just like, yeah, that's what I want to do. And I was like, that's kind of weird that you changed that quickly. And the other thing I knew about him is I knew he wants to own a Tesla, right? It's all the rage nowadays. Everybody wants to have a Tesla. That was his big car that he wanted to have. And he was always talking about, once I get into management, I've got the money, I'm going to get a Tesla. Well, once he was in management, perfect opportunity came around. Somebody came through in Baltimore and I guess slashed his tires, which happens unfortunately quite frequently in Baltimore, Maryland. And he had a pretty old car at the time, so he figured I'll just trade it in. And I was like, okay, he's getting the Tesla. That's what's going to happen. Here he comes. He gets a Tesla. And he came back with, I don't even know, but it was like a used, 2010 Honda Civic or something like that. And I was like, that kind of stand out to me, because here he was, he's management, making the money that, I kind of assume that he's making. Here's the chance he has to buy the dream car that he's talked about forever. And he ended up getting something completely different. So that's, so a lot of red flags started showing up there. Things like people should have been fired that were not fired. We had quite a few people who came to our office that if you were in any other job, you've been fired. Things like were caught with evidence of like deliberately lying to customers, deliberately manipulating the numbers to make sales. Things like going out to the field, but then just driving home and like staying there the whole day and that kind of stuff. And we, had evidence of like, well, this is happening and you're lying. And instead of getting fired, they were just convinced to quit, which I always thought was very strange, because if it was my office, I would like to have standards and say, well, this is how we're going to conduct ourselves. If you're going to lie, if you're going to cheat, if you're going to steal, you're not going to be a part of this team. But instead it was more like, well, we can't trust you right now. Do you think it's a good idea for us to continue working with you? Mm-hmm. And they'd say, no, probably not. And then you'd go, oh, okay, well, I guess it's your idea. It's your choice. I guess we're just not going to work together. And I talked to my boss about this a lot. I was like, why are we doing this? It just doesn't seem honest. And his answer was always like, well, it's about reviews. We can't afford to have the company get a bad review. We can't afford to have an ex-employee get mad and do something and that kind of stuff. I mean, even getting on this phone on this interview, he's one of the guys I called up and told him, hey, I'm going to do this. He didn't want me to say the word Baltimore, because he was still so concerned that somebody who was part of the now dead business, the business does not exist, has not existed for like a year, was going to get so mad and come after us, even though I'm states away, he's states away. None of us are in that location anymore. Mm-hmm. That paranoia is still so prevalent, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and what he said about the company cannot afford a bad review, actually what he means is the company cannot literally afford to pay unemployment. So we're not going to fire these people. We're either going to talk them into quitting, like you just described, or we're going to make conditions so bad for them, make the work environment so negative for them that they have no choice but to quit. Rarely will you ever get fired from Cydcor, Smart Circle, Credico, because they don't want to pay unemployment. They can't pay unemployment because a lot of these people, these owners who are supposedly making six figures, are barely scraping by themselves. Like you talked about, your guy had this old car. Most owners will still have an old car. We've heard from other people who've asked their owners, why don't you buy a Tesla? Why don't you buy this car that you've been talking about for forever? Since you are the owner now, you're supposedly making bank. You've achieved the dream that we're all working for. Why do you still have this 15-year-old car? Why do you still live with 6 other people in a 2-bedroom apartment when you're supposedly being able to afford all these things? The answer to that is they're not making the money that they've been promised. And if they are wealthy, like you talked about earlier, they probably come from money. They probably have a wealthy family. They probably had an inheritance. So there are ways that you can work for these places and be wealthy, but the odds of that coming from working from one of these places is almost impossible.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I mean, that's the conclusion that I came to on my own, right? It's like, well, it doesn't make sense why. I mean, his answer wasn't strong enough. And I'm a pretty smart guy. I can kind of figure out things on my own. It's got to be, well, we can't afford it. And if we can't afford that, then that kind of starts crumbling the whole idea, right? If we can't afford that, then what does that mean about what he's making? What does that mean about this? I was part of the office. We started the office in Baltimore like end of 2019 or so. Obviously, COVID happened. And so I was kind of part of the team when it all restructured, right? We went very virtual. Most of the office ended up getting let go at that point. And everything became much more virtual and that kind of stuff, which is, again, one of the reasons why I ended up not sticking on, because it just wasn't the same environment. It wasn't the same feeling. I wasn't able to connect with people the same way. And you could just kind of see how people were being treated, I guess. Like, you could see how like desperate they were for like positive. They needed it, and it was just such a week by week basis. And the lies and that kind of stuff were just kind of starting to show.
I have to ask about your friend, and you can answer this any way you want. You don't have to provide a lot of information, but I'm just really curious. You said you have a friend who's been in there for 8 years, and I'm just curious, what is their way of thinking? Like how have they justified to themselves that they're still in there for 8 years and this is still okay?
Well, so she's an amazing person. I'll start off right there by saying that I've known her since I started in the original office. She was one of the people that actually started that office, moved from another location to Raleigh to start that office. And she's now moved from that location and started another location in further up north. She's amazing. I mean, she's super hardworking, super funny. She's one of the very few people I've maintained a relationship with outside of the business. And yeah, it is difficult to see that she's still in it, and she's been in it for so long. I don't want to speak for her as to like why it is or stuff. You know, we talk every week and I hear stories that she tells me and that kind of stuff. I do think that there is some manipulation that's being used to kind of keep her around. For sure, if I'm like the owner side of things, the fact that she's been there for 8 years kind of starts to tear down my story that I tell all my new guys that, well, it only takes like a year to get here. And then there's a person in the office who's been there for like 8 years. Well, it doesn't really hold water. So there's definitely reason for them to say, hey, we need to get rid of this girl, which is kind of what happened for a little bit there. The campaign I was on, the office supply campaign, which I'm sure you're familiar with, has left Cydcor, I've heard, since I left the business. They're no longer with Cydcor. So they had to change their whole tactic of like, what are we going to sell and that kind of stuff. And they ended up doing just like a bunch of different, they're basically working like 3 campaigns at once. And the manager of that business that my friend's a part of, he has recently made the decision to stop having a physical office space, stop paying rent, and leaving and doing virtual, all virtual. And the way she's worded it to me is very much, it just doesn't make sense. There's always driving back and forth, and it's better for everyone's schedule if we just go out. But if you're on the outside, you realize, oh, he can't afford to pay for an office space.
Yep.
He can't. That business is shutting down, which it sounds like it's. I'm not going to get into it because it's their business, but it sounds like that's what's about to happen. Mm-hmm. And I would not be surprised if by end of the year, they're kind of gone. I don't. If you want to know something about me, I'm a very numbers-based guy. I like numbers. I like logic. Numbers can't lie to you. People can lie, but numbers can't. Yep. And of the hundreds of people that I have interviewed, trained, been to conferences with, gone on road trips with, I can definitively say there's 5 that I know that are still in the business to this day. One of which is my friend who is an assistant manager. She's in the assistant manager role. The other 4 are owners. And every single one of those owners that I know has had to close their business and open up under a different name or a different location or start from scratch or something like that. And that's 4 for 4. That's 4 owners have had to do that. There's got to be something wrong. Right? You can't say that. I just think it's bizarre. I mean, so when we moved to Baltimore, we partnered with another office, had a very nice office space, probably top 10 office space in all of Cydcor. I mean, CNN would rent our space out for like interviews, parties would be hosted there. It was like a very nice office space. But this guy during COVID went to Hawaii with a couple of his coworkers, ended up making some comments on like Twitter or something like that about like, oh, it's so nice to be here in Hawaii or vacationing. And certain locals, I guess, took it. He literally had an angry mob after him, literally had to go into hiding, had an angry mob. Because of that, had to shut down his business because it was getting like review bombed and opened up under another name. And you don't see that in like Target, right? Target's not gonna next week, well, let's change our name, let's change our logo. We pissed off this one person. We got to fix it, right? I'm not in no way saying Target's a perfect company. We should all work for Target, but sure, that's just not how a corporation actually works. I work for probably the most corporate company you could possibly imagine right now, coming out of the business, which is like the bane of existence. It's like what I would have killed myself if I had known this is what I'm going to go into. I'm still in sales, but it's not sexy. It's not glamorous. I sell nuts and bolts and washers. And if you're part of the industry, you know what company I'm talking about. And it's not nothing cool and sexy, but if if I'm speaking to the people who are in the business right now and who are afraid of like leaving because like, what if I don't get a job? The year I left the business, I bought a house. I moved to a brand new city that didn't know anybody, didn't have any friends or family, didn't know anybody. I paid for my wife to start going to college again, get a master's degree. I paid for flights to go to Florida. We went to Harry Potter World. She's a big Harry Potter fan. We did that for a 5-year anniversary. Wow. You know, a lot of the things that people in the business say, well, this is my goal. This is what I want to do. This is why I'm sacrificing now. I did it the year after I left the business, which has always stood out to me as like, that's kind of ironic. Yeah. And the lie they tell you is like, well, you need hundreds of thousands of dollars, you need millions of dollars before you can buy a house. You got to be worth $1 million, otherwise you're not going to be able to buy it. I am in no way ashamed to say that when my W-2 came across and whatever 2021 or whatever it was, it said $38,000. I made $38,000 my first year in a corporate gig, and I could afford all of that stuff pretty easily. And that number blew my mind because I was like, I had to have been making like hundreds of thousands of dollars. What are you talking about? I made $38,000 and I bought a house, and we bought plane tickets, and we paid for you to go to college. And she's like, yeah. And I was like, well, that's crazy to me. Yeah. So I did want to make that point to someone who's still in the business, is that like a lot of what will keep you there is the fear of like, you're not going to find a better opportunity. You're not going to find a better paycheck, a better environment. When the reality is, almost any job is better, right? They tell you that like, well, you're never going to get promoted faster. But my friend's been in that business for 8 years and essentially has not really gotten a promotion. An assistant manager is the same thing as a corporate trainer. Yeah. She's not learning any like new skills or something. You think if you worked at somewhere like a Walmart for 8 years, you wouldn't be promoted to a completely different role with a completely different paycheck. So yeah.
Yeah, 8 years and just an assistant manager.
Yeah, well, I don't want to diss her. I mean, I never made it to assistant manager.
Sure,
so I can't diss on her. I was in it for 3 and didn't even get halfway. Woo!
But then you also talk about the 4 owners, which you said 4 for 4 have all had, and you said had their offices closed, not closed their office, had their office closed and reopened, which basically means you're not an owner. You don't own your own business. Gary Polson owns your business. Vera Quinn owns your business. Cydcor owns your business. And it doesn't matter if you work for Cydcor, let me rephrase that. If your client broker is Cydcor, if it's Credico, if it's Appco, a group Ascenta, if it's Smart Circle, without those parent companies, your office does not exist.
Oh, 100%, 100%. I mean, I've been trying to be very careful during this interview to say the word manager and not owner.
Yeah.
Because I believe that you are definitely more of a manager than you are an owner. It's interesting. So coming from a Cydcor background, that's all I know is Cydcor. Obviously, I've seen your interviews with Smart Circle and that kind of stuff. But definitely the story that was told with us is like, well, Cydcor is the premier of these guys. These guys are trying to do what Cydcor is doing. And they're just not as ethical. They're not as great as they were. In fact, when we moved to Baltimore, what we were told is that there hasn't been an office there for years, and it's going to be prime realty, and people are going to be buying from us because no one's ever heard of us, and they're ripe for it. And my wife and I chose a specific location that was about 45 minutes from downtown Baltimore because my manager told me like, you should pick this spot because we're going to be focusing on this territory. Come to find out that the territory was like Smart Circle territory. So our territory was a lot smaller than we thought it was because these are all essentially the same company. It's not, we weren't like fighting with them and that kind of, like we had to communicate with the Smart Circle offices to make sure that we were not passing each other in the territory and that kind of stuff. And that was another red flag that stood out to us is I lived in this specific location 40 minutes away from the office because my manager told me so. Meanwhile, him and everyone else who moved with them, they all lived together. They all were like 5 minutes from the office. So anytime there was a party or a get together or let's go downtown, for them, it's like a 5-minute walk. For me, it's an hour-and-a-half drive both ways, at 9 o'clock at night to try and get there. And my wife has not gotten that over that just yet.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up your wife because it's kind of weird. So much of what you said have said so far you and I have shared such similar experiences, even though you worked for Cydcor and I worked for Smart Circle.
Well, it's one of the things I think really connected me with your documentary, your interview. I came across I did not look for your interview or your documentary at all. I literally was like on my couch like 12 o'clock and the YouTube algorithm was just like, hey, have this. This is a documentary for you. And I did not go to bed that night. I was like watching this thing like, oh my gosh. I was like, this guy's me. He's talking about his wife. He's talking, I was like, this is me. I know who this is.
Yeah. And you had mentioned though, so from the start, your wife seemed to be okay with this. I know you said when you were going from Raleigh to Baltimore, she kind of was the swing vote there, and she needed to be kind of convinced. But you actually said you brought her and your brother into this for a while, right? How did that go?
Well, so I recruited 2 family members into the business. So my brother is my younger brother. This was back when I was in Raleigh. He was looking for an internship for college. And I was like, well, why don't you come here for the summer, right? I'm fully bought into the business. Like, this would be a great opportunity. You'll get some sales experience, which, hey, worst comes to worst, you'll learn to communicate with people. You'll learn to talk with people. And I was like, you come on in, you'll have some fun. And he did. And he was there for the summer. He never got promoted out of the management program. I still give him trouble. I give him grief for that all the time, as he never got promoted out. And it just wasn't his thing. His personality is just not his thing. But he was there for the summer and he went back to school. My wife, on the other hand, had obviously been part of our business, had seen the business since day one. And she was very involved in coming out to office night. People knew her. I mean, she was as much as the office as she could be without being part of the office. She had been in finance, which is not a realm that she loved. It just kind of ended up being what she did in college. And, once we moved to Baltimore, she was kind of looking for a way out. And I was like, you know what, why don't you come with us? Why don't you leave your job and become the recruiter, the HR department of our company? So not the sales side, because she definitely is not the sales person, but she's really good with people. And it's like, why don't you come here? You know these people already. You've been to the office many times. You know what we're doing. You know what we're trying to believe. And she was fully bought into it as well, just with how I was bought into it, and that kind of stuff. And my wife is such a huge part of my life. I mean, I'm sure I've mentioned a lot, but very rarely will I make a decision that does not in some way involve her. In fact, it's funny you mentioned I got one of my notebooks here with one of the many goal cards that I have written in my life. I've got many goal cards. But I think it was an activity where we had to write down, like, what are you willing to sacrifice? What are you not willing to sacrifice? And I wrote down, I'm not willing to sacrifice time with my wife, was something that I was not willing to do. And so I thought, well, this is a perfect opportunity. I don't have to. She can come work with us and we build the office together. And we talked about, like, what will that look like in 5 years when I open my own office? And she'll be my recruiter, which I thought was like a unique and novel idea. But obviously, every single person does that, it sounds like, from every consultant's wife or every manager's wife is their recruiter. And I was like, oh shoot, you really get duped into that, huh?
Yeah.
So but yeah, so I mean, she was a part of it and fully bought in from the beginning, but she definitely fell away from it, I think, more quickly. She saw the more interview side and how many people would come through the door for us to get interviews and hear all the things they would say and see more like the reviews and that kind of stuff. And so she definitely, I think, fell away a lot quicker than I did. I think she came across your documentary well before I did. To her credit, she didn't tell me about it. She knew I was kind of fully into this, so she didn't want to like try and ruin that. But yeah, and so we made the decision together, like, it's time for us to move on. And I remember sitting down, having the conversation with my manager, tell me, we're not growing. I got 4 people on my crew. I've always had 4 people on my crew, and we're not getting anywhere else. And it's just, there's no point. I'm not going to put another 3 years in to get the next 4 people on my crew, and that kind of stuff. And his reaction was, okay, cool. Have a great day. Bye. Which is just kind of what you have to be. You were taught to like cut people out. You got to be like, okay, cool. Got to move on, on to the next thing and that kind of stuff. And that's kind of how it ended. Not really. It wasn't a big bang. Wasn't a big explosion. Wasn't very dramatic. Just kind of fizzled out. I walked out and I left. And, I've got one good friend who was continued with the business, but I didn't hear from anybody for like 6 months. Once you're out, you're out. You're not going to hear from anybody. Nobody's going to reach out and check in on you or anything like that. And to their credit, I didn't reach out to them either.
Sure.
But eventually did reach out. Come to find out, once I left, the company just kind of started disintegrating. People started leaving. They had one kind of push for a management. My buddy, he was pushing for management, but apparently wasn't really close to hitting the numbers. And that kind of, had one bad week and 5 people quit. And then he basically quit after that. And then they just never kind of built the office from there. And from what I've heard, they gave my manager an option, either do a retrain or you're done. And he chose the I'm done package. He left. He's in a completely different state now, closed it down. And that is my experience with the business.
Yeah, that whole thing of you put 3 years into this, and the final interaction of you leaving the business from your manager is, okay, see ya.
Yeah. I wish it could be better, for sure. I'm trying to look on the positive side of things. That's one thing I think the business did teach me is there some skill sets I did take away that I now use on a day-to-day basis, like work ethic, attitude. I do think some of that stuff is kind of important.
Sure.
I wish it could have ended better, for sure. I wish it could have been like, oh no, man, we really need you. But I get it. I understand, especially from his perspective of like, it had to be the business. He put 6 years into it to just get to where he is, right? And he's not going to let one person break it down for him. But yeah.
At the beginning of our conversation today, you said that you've been out for 2 years. But to quote you, I wrote this down, not a week has gone by that my wife and I haven't talked about it in some way. And you also mentioned earlier about kind of that feeling of paranoia that your former manager has about even, being contacted because of something that is said or something that's posted. And, I hear that from a lot of people too, who say, I was afraid to talk about this. I was afraid to come forward. But 2 years on, you think about this every week. What? I mean, that doesn't sound normal to a lot of people, probably, right?
No, it's definitely not. It's definitely not. And it's one of the reasons why I reached out to you in the first place is like, I got to tell someone about this, because I can just keep rehashing these same conversations with my wife and with people, or I can kind of get it out there. I think part of it is guilt, right? I've talked about before, like there's definitely things I did in the business, exaggerating stories, trying to, telling somebody a certain thing to get by. And there's definitely guilt that you carry with that, right? Even like sales. I mean, one of the things, there's two systems that keep this business going. One is the extremely long work hours, which doesn't allow for like anything besides this business. And the other is just being commission only. And 90% of these businesses are commission only. Some of them will tell you like, oh, we've got a minimum wage, but really that minimum wage maybe only lasts for like the first 2 weeks or once you get promoted, or there's like some sort of drawback system where if you don't meet a certain sales number, they're going to take that out of your paycheck next time. So it's not really like a guaranteed minimum wage. So being commission only, it's your brain starts switching into survival gear. It's time you got to figure out how to make it happen, right? And you're on your last door of the week and you've made nothing all week. And it's like, well, the sweet old grandma doesn't really know what kind of toner her printer uses, or that she could get a better deal if she just went down the road to Office Depot, but she needs it. And I'm here now and I'm going to upsell her a little bit, right? I would be lying to you if I said I did not do that. If I did not sometimes use what I could to make a sale. So I think that sticks with people. And just this is a reoccurring thing with a lot of people to talk to. It doesn't matter what stage you're in, management, if you were only in the business for 2 weeks, if you were in it for 6 months, people will walk away feeling guilty. And that's not, and you're right, that's not normal. If I just go to work for any big corporate company, I may not like the job, but very rarely am I going to have to do something that I think is morally unethical, or it's going to stick with me for 2 years. And my hope is we have this interview, I get everything out that I want to get out, and then I can move on and not have a weekly conversation about the business. Because my life isn't I don't have anything to do with the business anymore. Right? Like I said, pretty much everyone I know is out of it. I've got one friend who I talked to who's still in it. Both companies that I was a part of have closed down. They no longer exist. They physically are not around anymore. So I would like to move on with my life. That would be great. So that's what I want this to be.
Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice? As I mentioned to you, Alex, I mean, the main type of people I want to speak to is the people that are still in the business, right? Because obviously it's nice when you're out and you watch these interviews and it reaffirms what I believe. Yeah. But I want to have an actual impact on like someone who's still in the business. So I wrote down kind of things of like red flags to keep an eye on. Like I said, I've seen many of your interviews and a lot of people have brought this stuff up, but I jotted down a few things I noticed while I was in the business that have not been mentioned before. I don't know if you've really brought up an ICL. You've obviously heard that term before.
I've heard the term. Yeah, actually, one of the first times I heard that term was in the Smart Circle produced this propaganda video on their YouTube channel. It's actually one of the only videos on their YouTube channel that has like over 1,000 views, I think. And that's probably just from people analyzing it and criticizing it because it's so full of BS that which was, I'm proud of the fact that they produced that as a direct response to the slave circle. They will never tell you that, but if you just look at the tone and when it was published, yeah, it was this story and these interviews that caused them to have to justify.
I did not know Smart Circle used. I thought that was a Cydcor term. Well, it's a terminology that you hear if you're in the business. They tell you it stands for Independent Corporate Licensure. It's basically what they use to describe the offices. So if you're in the business, they don't say office, they say ICLs. This ICL, that ICL. Right? Vera, Quinn would be using this technology. Like this is the technology they would use. And the reason it was taught to me is that, well, this is kind of like an LLC, right? Most people know LLCs, or if you go business to business, you run across a lot of LLCs. However, if you Google the term ICL, it's nothing. It means nothing. It's not a legal term. It's not a business term. It doesn't mean anything. So for those of you who are in the business, if they keep talking about ICLs, congratulations, you are in one of these companies. And it's not a real thing. It's not actually a thing. Another red flag I wanted to point out, I mentioned before, if you're involved with people who've been there for a long time and they just constantly keep changing their goals, constantly keep changing their dreams, talking about this big picture, and then the next day it's a totally different big picture, like what happened with my boss and the car, the city, that's a red flag. The reason why they're changing their goals so quickly is because they have to, because they don't have a choice. The reason why he chose Baltimore is because they told him, you have to go to Baltimore. You can't go to Austin. There's no way that he said, oh, I've been saying Austin this whole time, but what's the weather in Baltimore like? Let me check it out there, right? No, they told him, you have to go to Baltimore. The reason why he bought that car is because he physically could not afford a Tesla. So just be aware that if your manager or leader is constantly changing their goals, it's because they physically are not able to achieve those goals. You should be aware of a high turnover rate. This is a pretty common thing if you're in any of these businesses. It's an extremely high turnover rate. It's actually kind of funny because my current job, they talk about how we have such a high turnover rate. Man, people keep quitting every 6 months. And I'm like, I'm used to like 6 people quitting every week. So this is nothing. But the business needs this. I mean, they'll tell you like, oh, we wish everybody would stay. But to be honest, they need people to be coming and going constantly because they got to keep the energy up. They've got to keep interviews coming. They've got to keep training, and people is a finite resource. There's only so many people in a city that you can interview, train, coach before you run out. So if you're noticing your office has a high turnover rate, even if you think everything your office is doing is a-okay and is great, there's a reason why. Obviously, Alex, you mentioned this before, reviews on sites. It's a pretty common theme that the majority of these reviews are pretty negative. Or at least, on Glassdoor, it'll have something like 3 stars or something like that. And they'll claim and they'll tell you like, well, the reason why is because the more successful you become, the more negative feedback you get. Look at Amazon, right? It's what happens with Amazon for sure. And yes, logically that makes sense. But also they're admitting the fact that Amazon is 1 billion times bigger than your shitty little marketing consultant firm, right? So whereas Amazon may have 1,000 negative reviews, that may only account for like 1% of their total reviews on any given website. Whereas your shitty office has 10 negative reviews, and that's 80% of your reviews. The percentages is what matters. And if you scale that to what Amazon has, you'd be looking at literally millions of negative reviews for your company, right? So be aware of that if the majority of reviews is negative, the majority of people who are leaving this business are writing a negative review, and the only people writing positive reviews are the people who are there, which I was one of them. There's a reason for that. I haven't really seen you talk about this before, but web change. I don't know if you're familiar with this at all, but has anyone ever shown you like this kind of structure, this diagram right here? Where it puts, sorry for the terrible handwriting, but it says Mitch in the middle. But that's how they would show.
I have so many of those shapes. I have my notebooks over here. I have so many of those different shapes and diagrams and BS theories written in here. I would really have to look in there and think, but no, the term I don't think I've heard before.
Well, so that's how we would describe and show teams, right? So we'd put, okay, Mitch's team, Mitch is in the center, draw a circle out. He's got Bob on this team. He's got Bobbity Bob over here. He's got Sir Johnny Bob over here, right? And that's how we would show teams and stuff. And what I realized is the web chain is just a different form of the pyramid. If you pick up the center dot and pull it up to a 3D model, it just becomes a pyramid. And that blew my mind when I first thought about it. I was like, that is so simple, and I am so dumb for not seeing that for the first time. So if that's how they're showing things like that, it's like, well, that's a pyramid for you. A big red flag is if they're constantly sacrificing guaranteed short-term goals for long-term potential gains. That's a problem. What I mean by that is like, okay, I'm not going to go home for Christmas, which happens quite a lot with like managers and that kind of stuff, because so I would make $100,000 in the future, or I'm not going to buy this car I want now, so I can buy this Lamborghini or whatever, you know, the popular cool car nowadays, Bugatti. I think that's what a lot of kids like in the future, right? If they're constantly doing that, that's a problem, because the question I've asked, and I've never gotten a good response back, is like, so what if your family died tomorrow? And that's what you were working towards, was to like spend time with your family, which is a horrible thought. It's not a good thought. And it's a very extreme thought, but it is a very realistic thought for sure, right? It's like, what if you, okay, I'm working really hard so I can spend time with my dad. What if my dad passed away tomorrow? Would it really be worth what I'm doing right now? Or should I just go and spend that time with them? Yeah. I know managers and people that have like missed Thanksgivings and Christmases for years in a row, just had no time for family and never done any of that stuff. That was one thing I was also not willing to do. They'd always tell you like, work during this, work during that. I never did it. I always went home, and it was one of the things that I look back and said like, well, maybe that's why I didn't get promoted. I wasn't willing to do that. And then the final thing, and I know this sounds silly, I know it sounds stupid, but it is a constant red flag I've seen. Again, I've met quite a few managers. If they have a weird fixation on Wolf of Wall Street, that is a red flag. If they look at that movie and say, I want to be like Jordan Belfont, that is a red flag. And I know it sounds silly, I know it sounds stupid, but if you've been in this business, that is the character that they all emulate, and they all fantasize, and they all look and dress like that guy, act like that guy. Oh, that's kind of what I do, and that kind of stuff. First of all, they don't understand how to watch movies, because clearly he's the bad guy in the movie. That's the point. And that shouldn't be the type of person that you want to be in the first place. Mm-hmm. So if there's I'm going to say fetishization of him, then get out. I would say it's probably not good. They're willing to dump you. But those are some red flags I saw. I know some are common, some are just more in my experience. Like if you're in one of these businesses and any of that is happening to you, you should probably take a look at like what's really going on. Again, if you come from the perspective of, well, they're telling me the truth, then nothing I say is going to matter. I could present all the evidence and the facts and the statistics and show you all this, and you're still not going to believe me. But if you start to think like, well, what do they have to gain from lying to me? And they have a lot to gain from lying to you. That's another thing that separates this business from anywhere else, is they need you. If they don't have you, the business does not exist. If I stop showing up to work at my current work, my boss gets a little pissed, but the business, his pay is not affected. His sales aren't affected. The business continues. His day-to-day operations continue. But if I stop showing up when I was in the business here, the whole structure starts collapsing, right? He makes no money because his money is based upon my money, right? And you got to realize like there is a very strong financial reason for them to lie to you, manipulate you, and keep you in the business as long as possible and not fire you, just because you pay their stuff. My overall experience was very positive. I in no way regret anything that I did in the past, but I would strongly caution someone who would want to come to it. If I had a friend who came to me and said like, hey, this is the business I'm going to be joining, and I could tell like, hey, it's one of these types of businesses, I would have a sit-down conversation, be like, okay, well, this is what it's really going to consist of. And you can do this if you want, and you could get some very good skills from this, but your whole life is going to be this. Your whole, every weekend, every afternoon, every day, it's going to be this. I just, again, want to point out that, again, the easy thing to do if you're watching this and you want to be critical is 100% label me as a failure. Well, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about because he failed. He never even got halfway to assistant management, so how could he talk about it? But again, I want to go back to like, well, why did I fail? And I wrote down just kind of like different reasons you could give for why. And reason number one is you didn't try hard enough. And I hope that through this interview, I've kind of shown that like, well, I definitely tried hard enough. I have notebooks on notebooks on notebooks. I've been to conferences on conferences on conferences. I've been to road trips, and anything that was asked of me, I've done. It wasn't that interested, just didn't have that enough. It wasn't that invested. And I can tell you, I definitely wasn't invested. Not only did I bring myself into the business, I brought 2 family members into this business, people I care about, who I love deeply. I believe that much in the business that I brought 2 family members in. You could argue, okay, well, he just wasn't skilled enough. He doesn't know what he was doing. I was pretty good at what I did. I don't want to, brag and make this about me, but my nickname when I was in the business was Mr. Consistency. I was the guy who was always on bell. You had a stud that you wanted to interview, you give him to me. You had a guy who was struggling, give him to Mitch. Even if it's not on his crew, give it to Mitch. He'll teach him. He'll get him through where he needs to get through. You could argue, well, he doesn't really understand the opportunity. He doesn't get it. Again, I was in the business for 3 years, which is a lot longer than 90% of probably the people who are in the business right now. I've been to many conferences. As you had mentioned before, Alex, I've gotten awards. I've got the little leader's pen pinned on me twice. I have no idea where those pins are at now, probably in the garbage. I've met with people that 90% of the people in the business have never met and consider like these godlike figures. I've been to the Cydcor headquarters, which 90% of people have never been to before. And you could say, and then the final thing you could say is like, well, he just gave up. And you're right, I did give up. But why did I give up? I think is the much more interesting question. Why, after 3 years, did I decide, hey, it's time to move on? So that's it. That's everything that I've got. I mean, one thing I did want to mention to you, Alex, is just in my conversations with other people who I know who've been in the business or maybe still in the business. I know there's a lot of people out there that like what you're doing and want to continue doing this. However, they're not super comfortable with like being on camera and getting interviewed and that kind of stuff. So my wife and I did create an email address if there is anybody out there who would like to reach out to me personally and tell their experience or tell their stories or just get something off their chest and not in like a super public forum like this. I've got the email address if you wanted me to share it or something like that, but I got that.
Yeah, go ahead if you don't mind.
So we made it pretty simple. It's former, former.icl.employee@gmail.com. If you email that, you'll be reaching out to me personally. Mitch, feel free to any questions that you've got about anything I talked about or anything that you've experienced in the business. If you're in the business right now and you have questions or you're thinking about leaving, or if you think I'm full of shit and you want to tell me why I'm full of shit, please feel free to email me. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you and not have it in like a big public space where potentially thousands of people could see it.
I love that. Thank you for that. That's wonderful, because I know that, I know there are a lot of people out there that would like to share their story, but they don't want everyone to know about it for a variety of reasons. And I'm not going to fault them for that, because I know that this whole thing is something that everyone could potentially see. And if you don't want your business out there for everybody, that's completely understandable. But yeah, we'll definitely include that in the video. Thank you for providing all this information. My favorite interviews are the ones that write themselves, and I barely have to do anything, and this was one of them. I don't know if that was because your story is so similar, but
I watched all the interviews I could watch. My wife and I last 2 weeks went through the whole process. What do we remember? She reminded me of some things I didn't even remember happening. She would be an awesome person. If you want to look at another perspective, my wife obviously saw the more recruiting side of the business.
Sure.
She would be an awesome person that maybe you could get on as well.
So Laura, Mitch at the end of his interview said that you might want to end up doing an interview, and a few weeks later, here we are. I do have a lot of questions about your experience and about Mitch's experience through your eyes, because it's always different when what the significant other sees and how they interpret it. But I'm just kind of curious, what made you want to, after I think you said in your message some deliberating with yourself, what made you decide to come forward and share your story too?
Well, I think 2 years ago, I really started to like binge watch your videos on YouTube, and I had an email typed out back then to you, and it was really long, and I was going to say, hey, I would love to, interview. And I deleted it. I just decided, you know what, I'm just going to move on. And I decided not to email you. But then Mitch came to me separately and told me that he really wanted to talk to you too. And I was like, okay, cool. And so he did. And I wasn't going to at first, but he was just telling me some of the things that he told you, and I thought to myself that it would just be really, I mean, I think it would be interesting to hear my side of things too, because there are a lot of gaps that he didn't fill with his story.
Mhm.
And so I just typed it out one day. I was trying to write a final paper for a class and procrastinating, so I decided to reach out to you. So here we are.
That's one of the best times when your mind is doing other things. You can concentrate on stuff you actually want to be doing.
Yeah.
And just for the record, so Mitch's interview has not been published yet. So no, you really don't have any knowledge of what he said apart from what he told you that he recollected through our conversation. So everything that we're going to talk about today is from your memory. So one of the things that when I was in Smart Circle that I had to deal with, and I say deal with, but it's one of the things I'm most thankful for in my life, this, 8 years on, is managing my wife and our life and the
Yes.
all-encompassing, I don't even know what to describe it, of Devil Corp companies like Cydcor and Smart Circle. In your message, you said that, Mitch was involved in this for, I think you said 2 years before you got involved in it. And I know when Mitch and I talked, he had said that before he got hired into this, he sat down with you and said, this is a commission only job and this is what it's going to entail. And you were supportive of that. You both decided, okay, let's do this. So 2 years in, before you got into this, what can you remember about being the spouse of someone who was completely bought in to Cydcor?
A lot. And I wrote a lot down, but I don't know if we have time to go through all of it because there's so much. A lot of it I don't remember, to be honest with you. But a lot of it I do. And I still remember to this day, he was applying for jobs. He was a teacher, a fourth grade teacher for 4 years. And that was what he was qualified for when he left teaching. And he didn't want to teach anymore. So there wasn't really anything for him to apply for. So he was struggling with like the direction of his new career. And I was working in finance, which was terrible for me. It was like not interesting at all. But I still remember the phone call where he told me, I remember where I was, and like I had to take a break from work. I went downstairs and I remember him telling me he was really excited about it, really excited about sales. And he wanted to know if I was okay with commission only. And to be honest, I was nervous about it, but he seemed really excited. And I never want to be that person who tells their spouse, like, you can't do this, So I told him to give it a try, and he did, and he really liked it. I will say though, I've talked to Mitch several times about this, and he does not remember this, which is so weird to me, but he swears that they were completely honest in their interview with him. But I remember him coming home the first day, and he was surprised to find out that it was a door-to-door sales job. And he remembers it as they told him it was sales and they told him it was commission. And he does not remember being surprised by that. But that was my first red flag, was on his first day coming home. And he also told me that the atmosphere seemed a little culty, which back then I had no knowledge of cults, or like nothing. I had no knowledge. And now I've gathered, a ton of knowledge, obviously. Sure. But yeah, that was my first red flag. And it's just so typical where they don't tell you the whole truth.
Yeah.
And it's like this bait and switch, which is, very typical of all cults, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was the first red flag.
And that's really interesting that you had a red flag from the beginning. And I know a lot of times it's not until we get out that we see the red flags. Loved ones might see them right away, but like you said, it really wasn't your place to voice any concerns, considering Mitch was, number one, enjoying it, eventually doing so well in it too. because you don't stay 2 years in Cydcor and be dead weight. You know, you are generating revenue, you are generating leaders, you are at the top, a core leader of your office. You mentioned there were a lot of other red flags that you noticed but never voiced. So along the same lines of that, the culty atmosphere and the door-to-door surprise, what were some other things you noticed as Mitch was going through this?
I remember, fast forward a couple of months, and he was really pushing me to join team nights, which I thought was so weird, and it made me really uncomfortable because I'm not an employee and I don't necessarily want to go anyway. And I don't want to come home from work and like go out to dinner with these people I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd rather stay home with my cats. But he really pushed me to go, and I finally went one day. I even remember the outfit I was wearing. It's like so strange, the things that come back to you. But and it was, the people were all really nice and they really wanted me to be there, but I felt like he asked them if I could go and they only said yes to be nice. Like that's kind of how I felt about it, and that's one of the reasons I didn't want to go. And I was always taught that you should separate work from your life, and that's another reason I didn't, because I don't invite my husband to my work stuff. That's weird. But anyway, I went because he kept asking me, and then I realized later on that I was a critical part in growing the office. Even though I wasn't employed, they had to get me on board if they wanted to keep Mitch. And it was a good way to show other new recruits that you can be married and be in this business, because that was a sticking point for a lot of people, was their spouse or family. And I was there to show them, no, you can do this. So that was interesting. I remember joining the business after all of these red flags. I joined anyway as the recruiter, and we were partnered with another office in the same building at the time, and they already had a recruiter who like had all these systems in place, and then COVID happened, so they had to get rid of her, and then that's why they brought me on. And so I was recruiting for my manager in Baltimore, and I was looking through their recruiting system, and they had a very exclusive recruiting process that eliminated certain groups of people based on their like names, how they sounded on the phone, not what they said, but just how they said it. And I was told by my manager, don't go by that process. But that just goes to show that, you know, that's there in the business. I mean, they don't have any sort of HR. They can recruit however the hell they want to. And there were like code names for people in the system too, of like, if you see this word, don't call this person. And my manager told me, you know, ignore all that stuff, which is great that I got that experience, but it's rampant. There's no accountability for that in that business at all. It's really sad.
You know, I've heard people say, other admins, other recruiters that I've talked to, that, oh, I'm essentially HR, but that doesn't mean you are HR. What HR really is, if Cydcor, if these companies had an HR, they would never make it because of all the violations that happen on a daily basis. I mean, literally what you said about how people sounded or different traits of them and not even calling them back. There's a word for that, and that's called discrimination, which is illegal.
Exactly.
Which, I mean, it's kind of interesting because they're being discriminated against, but that also means they didn't get sucked into this. So I mean, I kind of don't feel bad for them in that regard, but still, I think that's more of a character identifier of the people that work for these Cydcor companies. Recruiters and admins have such an interesting viewpoint of the business because they're not dealing with clients. They're on the back end, but if it's not for them, there's no way that these companies can function, because like any multi-level marketing scam, which is what Cydcor is, you need to constantly be recruiting. And you talked about something, and if I wanted to do some serious self-harm, I could go back through all of my videos, and anytime someone says I was desperate, take a shot, I'd be on the ground after 3 videos.
Yeah.
You say in your message, not only you as an individual were experiencing desperation for wanting to get out of your career, and that's why you ended up in Cydcor, but also you said as a recruiter, you noticed that desperation seems to be Cydcor's #1 most attractive characteristic in a candidate. And I don't think I've ever had anyone say it so blatantly, but that really makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So what were some of those characteristics that, you talked about, well, don't hire anybody with these characteristics, but what were those desperation characteristics that made the perfect Cydcor applicant?
I will say 2 things. The first, from my experience, I was desperate to leave a job that I hated, an industry that I hated. I was willing to do anything to get out of it. Like, I was willing to do anything to leave. And anything sounded better than what I was doing. So that's why I was so attracted to this opportunity, as they call it. But I noticed that people who were most willing to come on board were new college graduate, or that was at least what we were trained to look for, was new college grads.
Yeah.
And especially people who are new college grads in like October have been looking for a job right out of college for several months now and are so desperate to find anything. They will do whatever you tell them. So it was mainly college grads that I was told to look for, but they don't know anything about the workforce. When you graduate college, you don't know anything.
Yep.
And so they were just really easy targets too. And then, people who had families, I tried not to call older people because I figured they would have families, and like I felt kind of bad sucking people with children into this. But yeah, I would say mainly college graduates. But it really is like people who are desperate will do anything. I did.
Yeah. You just said about how when you were faced with somebody who had children, that you kind of felt bad for them and didn't want to suck them into this. So it seems like obviously you have 2 years worth of red flags to consider before you yourself, being desperate, decided, okay, well, I might as well get into this. It's something different. So that tells me that even as a recruiter, you were kind of already aware that you were calling people to get them involved into something that might not necessarily be on the up and up, right?
Yeah.
So how did
you asking how I sleep with myself, or how
well,
I
I was going to ask how did you balance that at the time? Because this is your job now that you left your previous career, and your spouse is very heavily invested into this. So how were you able to balance, I guess, the three prongs of, this is my job, but it's really shady, but I also have to kind of support my husband as well?
Yeah. It was hard in that, like with any cultish organization, you have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to justify whatever you're doing. And I felt the reason that I didn't suck people in that had kids, but I justified it to myself by saying, well, they're probably not going to stay very long anyway. And you have to make a certain amount of money if you have kids. And generally in this business, people starting out don't make that much money. So I just, justified it to myself. Are you familiar with Yanya Lalich?
No.
Okay. She's this cult expert, and she has this really good analogy. And she says, being in a cult is like, or getting out of a cult is like, you have this shelf in the back of your mind. And over time, that shelf is where you put all of the doubts and all of your questions, and you just store them on that shelf. But eventually the shelf gets too full and it breaks and it falls off the wall. And that's when you decide you have to leave. And so it was just a lot of putting things on that shelf. And it's a good analogy, right? I can't take credit for it.
No, that's a really good analogy. Because I've done a lot of research into cults too, and I feel like that's a really common, a different way to put it than I've heard, but that's essentially what happens to a lot of people who finally decide to leave, like Scientology, for example. They found out they've had suspicions, and then they found out something, and then it's just they can't bear it anymore. So they literally have to try to escape. And we can look back on this channel and talk or look at other videos of people who've done the same thing, where it's just buildup after buildup after buildup of all these doubts, and you can't deny it anymore. So anyone who gets really deep into Cydcor, like your husband did, you know that it's full speed ahead. It's blinders on. It's 100% the business, the opportunity. You can get as in-depth in this as you are comfortable getting, but was there ever any personal conflict between you and Mitch about the amount of responsibilities he had, or another team night after working another 10-hour day, or like, was there any type of conflict resulting from those things?
No. And I think that as far as the time goes, you're all there all day at work, and then you have team nights and you're spending so much time not at home. I think that worked for us, actually, because we both value alone time a lot. Okay. And so it wasn't that big of a deal for me to be, I got bored sometimes, but I knew too, it was gonna pay off. That's what they teach you is make sacrifices now for the payoff later, no matter what the sacrifice is. But I knew that it was going to pay off eventually, and he's building relationships, and he's building a team, and it's going to get him promoted faster. So that didn't create any conflict. And he was really good too about not coming home and venting about his day, because that's another thing they teach you, is to have a positive attitude.
Right.
Which still makes me cringe to this day. But he never came home and complained about his day, because he would have felt really bad about doing that. He would have felt bad putting me in that position of having to listen to, not that it's like a chore, but having to listen to him complain about his day. No one wants to hear that, is what they tell you.
Sure.
And then he would have felt guilty to his manager for coming home and saying things behind his back to his wife. And so there was never really any conflict in that regard. I will say towards the end, I started to get, actually, I found your channel is what happened. And so towards the end, there started to be more of a conflict of, personally, do I go to Mitch and tell him I'm interested in leaving? Because, he's in a cult. So, or we both are. So like, how am I supposed to get him out, And then too, he did start to come home more and more frustrated. And it got to the point where I was like, you need to make a decision here, because he wasn't getting anywhere as far as his building his team and building his income. And I wasn't making that much money either, because they don't pay recruiters anything. Mm-hmm. And so it didn't create conflict with us, but we really came to a point where we were like, okay, it's time to make a decision. And we kind of both reached the boiling point with the business at the same time, which is really lucky, because otherwise, I don't know what I would have done, to be honest. I have no idea what I would have done. It would have been so hard to leave without him.
Yeah.
And watch him crumble in the business, knowing that I left him there,
Sure.
So I'm really thankful for that.
Yeah, it sounds like that could not have worked out any better, because that would have been a tough conversation. Because I think you said you were only there for 6 months, so in the grand scheme of things, not very long, but long enough to know what you were doing, what you were getting yourself into. because you had said earlier, before you even got involved in this, that you were a critical part of growing the office, because they always talk about getting your circle invested, right? Who are your closest influences, and making sure that you can sell them on this opportunity.
Ugh.
So once you got in, were you like, what was your relationship like with other recruiters? Was it influenced at all because they knew that you were Mitch's spouse and that he was this rock star? And I guess moving up to, how would you describe this recruiting job as kind of different and weird, I guess, weirder than anything else, any normal job that anyone would probably find?
I think from my perspective, I mean, people may tell me I'm wrong, but I feel like since I was married to Mitch and everybody loved Mitch, not just the work he did, but his personality. I mean, what's not to like? I may be biased, but everybody really, really liked me too. And they loved the idea of Mitch being promoted out and me being his recruiter.
Of course.
And Mitch and I would have conversations about like, oh, we're going to be on the cover of the Cydcor magazine one day as like this power couple. Like we had like such silly conversations about it. But I remember my managers promoting managers recruiter. So like the recruiter above me, really taking me under her wing. And she was really good at her job. Really good at her job. And we had a really good relationship. And I kind of felt like the favorite child in a way, because everybody loved having me there. And I think they liked what I represented more than anything. But I don't know. I mean, maybe I like misinterpreted it, but I felt like really like the golden child, like I could do no wrong. And that felt really, really good, like huge ego boost, you know? And so being married to Mitch really influenced my relationships with other people in the business. But it was such a strange job. I had never been in recruiting before, but I had never heard of anybody in recruiting making 75 phone calls in one day, or booking 6 interviews for the next day, or memorizing a script and lying to people on the phone about the job. And it was just so strange. And the relationship that I was required to have with my manager, I thought was so weird. It was so weird. I am a recruiter. I should not be like this business partner. I didn't pay money to join this business. And it was so weird. And then towards the end, they started to turn, I don't think they intentionally did it, but they kind of tried to turn me against Mitch a little. Which was another like red flag, but I ignored it. But it was just really weird, the things that they asked me to do. Like when I left, the recruiter above me called me, and she was pretty pissed because I didn't tell her that Mitch was thinking about leaving. And I was like, what planet are you living on where I'm going to tell you my husband's deepest, darkest secrets about the business? Like, what drugs are you on, lady? And then I got really upset at my manager over something a few days later, and she called, or I called her to vent about it. And then hours later, he approached me about the subject. And in my head, I was like, this is why I don't tell you guys anything, because nothing is sacred here. Like, you're going to go tell him. Like, why would I tell you? Why would I tell you his secrets? Because he's my husband. But also, why would I tell you when I know you're going to tell my manager? So anyway, the relationship with the manager thing was weird. We were really close, and we were great friends, and I still talk to him to this day. But I will say that the relationship they fostered between manager and recruiter is so strange. And it's no wonder that a lot of them like get married, because they just force you to be so close with this person and be with them all the time. And anyway, it was just really strange.
So when I talked to Mitch, at least in the first part of our conversation, he made a point to emphasize that you can definitely get some positives out of this. And he is of the mindset of, I really did. I gained a lot of positive things from this. Can you say the same thing?
I am a more stubborn, petty person, so I don't love to say the same thing. I will say, I also don't like living with regret. And I don't love the thought of regretting our time in the business because we spent 3 years there.
Mm-hmm.
But we spent 3 years, 2 of those years in Baltimore. And when we moved down, this is like a stupid side story, but we moved down to South Carolina and I started to watch The Wire, which is based in Baltimore.
Yeah.
And I could not finish that show, even though it was so good. I could not finish it because it reminded me too much of my time there. And it was so depressing. I didn't want to think about that. Mm-hmm. And so I did gain positives from the business. It taught me a lot of good skills, but the experience overall, I would not say is one I'm thankful to have. And I would never tell the people in the business that I'm glad I was in the business because I'm just too petty for that.
You in your message, you talked a little bit more about your current path. Like you and Mitch both said, you've moved on from this. You've moved hundreds of miles away. You're back in school. I think he even talked about that. You are looking to get a degree in marriage and family therapy and hoping to specialize in cult recovery, which is very cool. Yep. And I know you mentioned that word a few times in this interview. And anyone can look back on this channel and see dozens of other interviews at this point of people saying the same thing. What might you say to somebody who comes across this, and they don't even have to be in the business, because I hear this too from time to time, people who've never heard of this stuff, but they say, oh, you can't call everything a cult just because you don't agree with what they do or whatever. You just can't call that a cult. What do you think about that?
I would say, sure, you can call anything a cult. But I'll say this. So there is a man, Steve Hassan, who is a cult expert. I'm sure you've heard of him and his bite model. If you come across any organization and they check off the boxes of the bite model, then I would say don't join the organization. And so bite stands for behavior, information, thoughts, and emotion. And cults generally try to control all 4 of those things. Cydcor definitely checks all 4 of those boxes. I would say if anyone checks any of those boxes, you should question them. And if you don't get your questions answered, then leave or don't join. You definitely can call this a cult. I struggle still calling it a full-blown cult, but I think it has a lot of culty aspects, especially the multi-level marketing part of it. And I tell people when they ask about it, I always say that it seems like a multi-level marketing scheme because that's what it started out as, and the recruiting process hasn't changed much from that. And multi-level marketing schemes are very predatory and very culty, and so that is what I think of the business. But I would say if anyone was looking to leave or looking to join, I would tell them to ask questions and continue to ask questions. And when you come away from those conversations, ask yourself, were my questions really answered? Or did they just throw a bunch of platitudes at me? And if your questions were not answered, ask them again, keep asking them. And if you don't get satisfactory answers, then you should seriously think about leaving.
Yeah. And the bite model, I mean, I've been using the bite model since I started researching this topic 6-7 years ago when I started working on the film. And I can't remember, and I'm not going to count right now, but I know there's about between, I think, 35 and 40 different characteristics in the bite model. And I know that the number that is present in, or that is used in Cydcor Credico Smart Circle is very high up there. I know, I don't remember in the original film, I said one number. I know that I updated that a couple years ago. It's pretty high up there. I mean, if you really go down the list of all of the different types of, like you said, behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control that these multi-level marketing companies do, it's really kind of frightening, because
Yeah.
this is exactly what cults do. You know, pick any cult, religious or personality or political cult, they do these things. Cydcor Credico Smart Circle do these things. So I think that's why, I know that's why, and I do not throw that word around lightly, cult. I'm not going to call something that's not a cult a cult. But yeah, really hard cult-like aspects to this. So that's why we call it a cult. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to do so.
Agreed. Could not agree more. I could give you examples of all four of the, the bite model of all four of those that they do in Cydcor. I mean, having maintained a positive attitude is controlling your thoughts. And that's in one of the thingies, the 8 great work habits. Oh gosh, can't believe I remember that. Agreed, you can't call everything a cult. And just because some things have cultish aspects doesn't mean that they're automatically bad.
Sure.
But when you have an organization that does so many culty things, it's like, I'm going to call it what it is. It walks like a duck. It talks like a duck. It is a duck.
A few times a year, at least, I get a message from somebody who says, this person, and it's usually a family member, or it could be a spouse, sibling, something like that, is involved in something that sounds like a scam, something like this. How do I bring it up to them? How do I hopefully try to get them out of this? And I know, thankfully, you didn't have to do that. You were able to steer away from that conversation. But if the time came and you had to have that conversation, what do you think you would have said? And what do you think someone else can say to maybe try to get somebody to see things differently?
That's a good question. Back then, I think I would have probably gone at it with a blunt axe, which is not the way to do it. When someone is in a cult or this organization, whatever you want to call it, you have to be very delicate with it. You can't go at it directly, like saying, hey, this seems like a scam.
Yeah.
Because one thing that they teach you in these organizations, I was actually just talking to a friend about this who was also in it, is that the us versus them mentality. And if anybody questions what you're doing, that's a good thing. Like, if anyone is doubting what you're doing, that's a good thing, because that just means like they just don't get it and you're doing the right thing. And if you just work really hard, you'll show them. And so when anyone expresses doubt or questions about this organization, just expressing it entrenches them further into the business. So you have to be careful the way that you bring it up. But I think two main really important things to keep in mind are that you should continue to stay in touch with the person. Don't like get so mad at them that you never talk to them again. Stay in touch with them. You don't always have to talk about the business with them, but just make sure that you're like texting them or calling them, having conversations. And then the second thing I would say is put things on that shelf. Ask them questions. Ask them, hey, how do you feel about what happened last week? Or what are your thoughts on this? And that doesn't add up with what you said a month ago. Or why have you said this whole time that you're going to be promoted in a year? It's been 2 years. Why are you still not promoted? Like, just ask them those questions and get them to talk about it. And eventually they will see that, their shelf will fall. I do want to ask you, who do you think generally watches these videos? Do you think it's people who are in the business, or do you think it's people who have left?
Well, there's a few groups. There is a contingent of fans who watch these or listen to these while they're doing other things, and I'm very grateful for them because they get the views up. I would never listen to these myself, but hey, everybody has their own interests. So that's the first group. The second group, I know there are people in the business that that watch these for a variety of reasons. It might be just to give it a quick thumbs down. It might be in Credico's case to file a defamation complaint and get it blocked off YouTube in the UK. And then there might be
it's blocked.
Oh, any video about Credico is blocked in the UK because the defamation laws are different in the UK than in the US, and they're headquartered in the UK, so that's how they're able to get away with it. But you can watch those blocked videos with a VPN. There's a video about that on this channel as well.
Okay.
And then the third group, the third group I think is kind of the most miscellaneous catch-all. It's the people that either may have watched other videos about cults or LuLaRoe or Herbalife, and somehow one of these videos gets in their recommended videos, or it's the person that is in the business who has a sick day and is barfing their guts out, and that's the one way they can stay out of the field. So they're at home scrolling on their phone, or they just got home from working a 16-hour day and they're exhausted in the bathroom and they're taking 2 minutes to find something to look at. It's those people as well. So there's a healthy balance. I would really love, and I guess there's probably a fourth category too. It's people who are not in the business, who might be seeking out information about things like employment scams or charity scams, or things like that. And I would love to get that fourth group, the group that has never come in contact with any of these companies, like high school graduates, college students, to get this information in front of them before they could possibly get sucked into something like this. So it's a variety.
Yeah. Well, the reason I ask is because I don't really want to preach to the choir here. I don't want to tell people like what to look out for if the only people watching are the people who left. But one thing I will say is something that they preach and I've seen people talk about this in other videos too, but something that they preach pretty heavily in the business is the opportunity, right? And look how much money you can make. And they have meetings about the opportunity specifically.
Yeah.
Being so close to the manager when we were in Baltimore, as a friend, I really got to see the dissonance between what they were preaching you could make and what he was actually able to afford to buy. And if you're in this business to make a bunch of money, I'm here to tell you, buddy, it ain't happening. You're not gonna make a lot of money. I would be so interested to see the W-2s of the consultants, the people who are like the cream of the crop. You want to get them on your Zoom calls, and I'm sure that they're like not nice people in real life, but I would be so interested to see their W-2s, but unfortunately I don't think they're ever going to be released. But you're not going to make a lot of money, and I think that's what they preach the most, is the opportunity of the money that you are able to make, and like being an entrepreneur, which also is not true, because when you shut down your office, everything goes back to Cydcor. You don't get anything from it. So the opportunity is a lie, and if that's why people are in it, then and sadly you don't learn until you're promoted. You don't learn that. And then by that point, you're so invested that when things are not adding up, you justify it to yourself. You do these mental gymnastics and you just dismiss everything that makes you question the business. And the opportunity is really, truly not there. The only reason I think we stayed in it for so long is because I was getting paid a lot of money in my finance jobs, and we were able to afford for Mitch to work only on commission. Otherwise, I don't think we would have ever been able, he would have been out a long time ago if
Yeah.
that were the case. But I think that's one of the reasons I was only in it for 6 months, is because I wasn't making a lot of money anymore, and we couldn't really afford to live anymore. And so I think just that the opportunity is a lie, and that's what the biggest thing that they preach to you is really important for people to wrap their minds around. Like, it's not true.
Yep. Yeah. The opportunity is a lie. I think that in and of itself is good enough. Because it's true. And you brought up a couple things, like the impression of wealth. You're taught when you become a higher up or when you become an owner to always look the part. So you might be driving a 20-year-old car. You might have to get that fancy watch from a pawn shop or from a secondhand store, but at least you have the watch. A good looking suit. It might be your only suit, but it's a good looking suit. And something that I've discovered is the owners that are legitimately wealthy in these companies usually come from money. This has been something that's brought up in a lot of recent interviews, is that they'll talk about being self-made. They'll talk about being, working, being exactly where you were, starting from nothing. But they don't talk about the fact that they were born with a silver spoon in their mouth, or that they lived in a 12-room house growing up and their families were very, very wealthy, or they had a large inheritance, or they have a trust fund. They'll never admit those things to you.
No.
The one example, and this is a Credico joker, but Justin Cobb, he's like the god of gods in Credico. But I've seen comments from people who know him, or at least know a little bit more about him than other people do, and say he comes from a wealthy family. He has stepped on a lot of people to become wealthy, and we again, this is a good example. We don't know how much wealth he has. He could be making, he advertises that he's this multi-millionaire, but he's probably pulling down maybe 6 figures if he's lucky. But yeah, his family's wealthy. The work, the impression that he gives is, this is all me. No, it's not, dude. You come from wealth. And you had talked about, you unfortunately don't find out that you don't make money until you get to owner. Because like myself, I was always taught you get to owner, that's where the money is.
Yeah.
I didn't realize until the first episodes of this web series that that's not true. And there are 2 types of people. Once you get that high, there are the people that realize, oh, well, I was scammed. This isn't real. I need to get out of this. And then there's the other type of people, which I think are the Ken Lears and the Justin Cobbs and the Michael Sessions and the Antoine Noras. Oh, wait, hang on. Okay. I'm sorry. Michael Sessions is a joke to me. Like, I can't take anything about Michael Sessions seriously, but I love it when I mention his name and people have a visceral reaction of disgust. So
I've not heard that name in forever.
I'll get back to my original point if I can remember it, but we got to talk about Michael Sessions. So tell me about Michael Sessions.
Okay, I would love to. So this is a whole story. So when COVID happened, our office got shut down and we had to work. Mitch had to work from home because he was one of the people that they kept on.
Yeah.
And our manager went through this. He popped an Adderall one day, which he would be very mad if I mentioned that, which I don't care. But he popped an Adderall one day. And he came up with a list, like a schedule on, like, if we can't go out to the field, we've got to show that we're like working. So what can we do? Which, fair enough, I understand that. Like, it's kind of disheartening to not have a job. But anyway, one thing that they would do was they would listen to this Michael Sessions podcast, And I had no idea that he was part of the business. I thought this was just some sales guy that they were listening to this podcast about, because he was giving like sales tips and stuff. And I got into the business several months later, and they started talking about like Michael Sessions' recruiter. And I was like, dumbfounded. Like, we have a celebrity in our midst. Michael Sessions is part of the business. I could not freaking believe it. And he had this thing in his podcast, something that he, like a tagline that he said every episode. And it became like a running joke in the office. And it was maybe the way he said his name or something. But his recruiter said, or someone told me, that he has this really high standard that he holds recruiters to, and nobody can meet the standard of the number of interviews, and he's very cutthroat with his recruiters too, and he will fire you the moment you don't meet his standard and hire a new recruiter on. And it's like, dude, you're living a dream if you think people can make 300 phone calls in a day. You're living in a delusional reality. It's not real. But anyway, yeah, I have not heard that name in forever.
I think that quote, "You're living in a delusional reality," is goes a long way for a lot of these people.
Yeah.
Any of these higher ups. So going back to what I was saying before, the people like Ken Lear, like Michael Sessions, Vera Quinn, over in Smart Circle, Larissa Hawley, over in Credico, Justin Cobb and Josh Cody, over at Universal Events, Mike Putnam and Harmony Vallejo. They are all living in a delusional reality, but they are also the second type of person who at some point along the line realized, oh wait, this is a scam, but I can be successful in this scam. I just have to keep the narrative of the scam going. And this is what I'm going to do the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And when you really spend time, and I can only attest to the Smart Circle scumbags, but when you spend time around these regional consultants, these national consultants, even the CEOs like Larry Tenenbaum, Gary Polson, Antoine Nora, Chris Niarchos, all these names that we've learned in the past 4.5 years, you really do get the sense of, A, they're living in a delusional reality, because their reality, there's no way that their reality could possibly exist. And B, they have to know, or they have had to have learned at some point, that this is not legitimate.
Yeah.
But they found out that they can make money off of it.
Yeah.
And if they can make money off of it, and if they can show other people, even if it's just down one level, how to make money off of it, if that's recruiting 100 people a month, 80 of those are going to quit. But out of those 100, you might find 20 halfway decent people. And out of that 20, you might find one person that you can promote out. Doesn't matter if they end up getting shut down in a year and being forced to move to another city and no unemployment and they don't know anybody. You could still make a little bit of money off of them. That's okay.
Yeah.
And I think most rational people would hear that and be like, oh my gosh, I would never want to work for a company like that. But then,
well, unfortunately, rational people are the perfect people for cults.
Yeah.
That's who they recruit. So
yeah. Because after a while, it becomes kind of like a drug in a way, because of going back to the bite model, things like the love bombing that takes place. Just the total psychological manipulation, because they do have they have an answer for everything. Like you prefaced before, they drill into you. Your family, your friends, they're not going to understand this. So any criticism they give you is out of ignorance. You're the one that's actually in it. You know what's going on. So your best source for information about who to talk to and what to believe has to be from this group of people right here. Network up, don't network down, and don't network out.
Yeah,
so
and just
they're
wait
able to
till
keep
you
you
show
insulated.
them. And it's all about like showing like the I told you so, being able to say, well, I told you so. Like I remember one time we were at a wedding and Mitch's brother came up to us once, and I was really mad that he did this, but he said, how is your pyramid scheme going? And the reason I was so mad is because no one had ever come up to us and asked us that before. So I knew that his family was talking about it behind our backs. And, oh, that's what you think of it? I looked at Mitch and I said, I cannot wait till we show them. And it's like, it like gives you fuel to keep going, which is why it's so detrimental to go at people directly on and say, you're in a pyramid scheme, like, hello.
Yeah.
You really, if you go at it with a blunt axe, then you're not cutting down the tree.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
And
yeah.
that's one of the big issues too, is because if there was a universal answer to how do I talk to somebody who's involved in this, then we'd be able to get everybody out. We'd be able to get them out tomorrow. But yeah, it's not that easy.
Yeah, there's just so
Cults
much
are very powerful.
Yeah, there's so much psychological manipulation within Cydcor. They have an answer for everything, and if they don't have an answer for it, either they'll get back to you, or how could you ask that question? Like, you're in the wrong for even asking the question, and they're just preventing questioning and preventing dissent, which is what cults do.
That's what cults do. I feel like we're singing a song and the chorus always comes back to, that's what cults do.
I know. Well, it feels kind of silly to call it a cult because I wasn't in Nexium or Scientology. I was in I got paid for what I did. I didn't get paid a lot, but I got paid for the job that I did. But if you look at the objective facts, it is, at the very least, it is very culty. Whether you want to call it a cult or not, it has a lot of characteristics of a cult. But yeah, it's just, it was really interesting to be sort of against it, not against it, but like being married to it, but not being in it. And then being so desperate that I joined later, and then finding your videos and leaving. And now look where we are. We have so much more than we could ever have dreamed of in Cydcor, in corporate jobs, which is the devil in Cydcor.
Yeah.
They make you fear a corporate job, which is so dumb.
They make you fear any opportunity.
Yeah.
They make you fear any opportunity that's not them.
Yeah.
And I know when I talked to Mitch, he said, within a year, you guys bought a house. You're back in school now. This house that I live in now, I bought it a year and a half or 2 years after I left Smart Circle. And a big shout out to everybody that has viewed the Slave Circle, because that's helped me pay a lot of bills too. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
But I think we can justify it. I'm willing to go further than culty. I'll call it a cult. And I think it's, aside from the bite model, because we can go back to the bite model all day, but something that draws the line for me is that, granted, yes, you can look at any cult and say, you'll find people who say, well, this helped me in some way. Because that's usually how cults work, is they'll look for desperate people. They'll look for people that are lost, that are looking for something, and they're not sure what it is, but they'll give them that. Mm-hmm. And if it doesn't end in self-destruction, they could see some positives in it. And if it improves your life, good for you. Yeah. Granted, I'm sure many people feel the same way about these companies that we're talking about here. But the thing that draws the line for me is that, just like cults, these companies destroy lives.
Yeah.
Because let's say you make it to owner. I always put myself in that position. Let's say I made it to owner and I wanted to open up here. No, you can't. We're going to send you over here. We're going to send you 500 miles away. You don't know anybody. You've never been to this city. You're hundreds of miles now, hours from your support system. You're isolated. You're by yourself, which is another very key component of cults.
Yep.
And let's say your office gets closed down because you're not an entrepreneur. You're going to get closed down. Now you don't have a source of income in a strange city. I'm sure you just signed an apartment lease for a year that you can't pay for.
Yeah.
Your life is destroyed. And it's destroyed because of Smart Circle, because of Cydcor, because of Credico, Ascenta, Cobra Group, all of them. They're all exactly the same. They destroy lives. And that's why they're cults, is because just like Scientology, just like Jonestown, just like any personality cult, they destroy lives.
Yep. I think that I was listening to a podcast by two people who were in NXIVM called A Little Bit Culty. Big shout out. I love that podcast. If anyone wants a podcast, that one's worth a listen. But they were saying that they were in NXIVM, and one of the hosts was one of the women that got branded. And not everybody who went through NXIVM got branded and went through that horrible experience of that secret organization. But just because you had a good experience doesn't mean that lives weren't ruined. Like, if you had a good experience, fair enough. I'm not here to tell you that it's worthless, but you have to look at other people's perspectives too. Just because you had a good experience does not justify the lives that are ruined. So, I mean, if you had a good experience, that's great, but not everyone does. Most people in Cydcor and other organizations don't have a good experience, and they live with regret, and they live with bankruptcy, and they live in poverty, and it's awful. So you can ignore that, but you shouldn't.
It's always easy when you're in something, it's always easy to ignore the horror stories. Just like in this, right? Anybody who leaves, anybody who speaks out, you're just a miserable failure.
Yeah.
Granted, we can afford to buy a house, and we're making a hell of a lot more money than we ever did in Double Corp.
Yeah, but we're slaves to
I'll
corporate
be a
America.
failure. Slaves to 9 to 5 schmucks. What do you think you're
you
doing?
bozos. What a bunch of losers.
I'll tell you what though, Laura, I love being a loser. It's been so much fun being a loser.
It's so nice to come home and just be a loser couch potato and watch TV and not have to go to a team night. Like, I'll be a loser for the rest of my life. Bring it on, baby.
Working from home 2 days a week on a salary.
Yeah. A guaranteed paycheck.
Yep.
Gosh.
Dental, vision, all the benefits that nobody gets until you get to the higher ups.
Well, even then, I think you still have to provide it for yourself. But you know what, Alex? You're the biggest loser I've ever seen. I would never want your life.
I know. I mean, I look like one, don't I?